Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Forensic Science, a very short introduction, second edition, by Jim Fraser, narrated by Charles Constant. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface to the second edition. Much seems to have changed since the first edition of this book a decade ago. DNA technology has continued to develop and is now more sensitive and discriminating than ever before. Digital forensics has become embedded in police investigations and continues to grow without apparent limits. Legislation such as the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016 now requires the analysis and identification of many new illicit substances. There have also been developments that were less positive. The National Academies of Sciences, NAS, reviewed forensic science in the USA and raised many concerns about practices, standards, and knowledge in that country. Their report described a fragmented and inexplicably variable sector with arcane and unjustifiable practices. Many of these issues arose from the distinctive characteristics of the legal systems in the USA, but there were also many general findings of relevance to other jurisdictions. Over the decades since the report was published, research has continued to confirm many of its findings. We can add to the NAS report findings particular difficulties encountered with fingerprint examinations in the McKee and Mayfield cases in Scotland and the USA. All of these issues continue to shape how forensic science is used in investigations, in the laboratory, and in court. In the first edition, I tried to balance some of the more optimistic presentations of forensic science that the general audience might encounter in both fact and fiction with a more nuanced perspective. I continue this theme in the second edition. The assumption that all forensic science, whatever that may be, is always objective, reliable, and useful is, in my view, both oversimplistic and over-optimistic. The text has been extensively revised. I have added new material, 2 new chapters, Drugs and Toxicology, Chapter 8, and a case study, Chapter 9. To make space for this new material, I have simplified the text elsewhere without, I hope, diminishing its content. I have reduced the number of tables and simplified some that are retained. Finally, I have introduced numerous case examples, mostly from my personal experience, which show the real-life use of forensic evidence. Preface to the first edition. There is more interest in forensic science now than at any previous time in history. There are more students studying forensic courses in the UK than ever before, and there is a seemingly endless list of TV dramas that are testimony to huge popular interest in the subject. In real life, forensic science attracts enormous media attention in high-profile cases such as the deaths of Jill Dando, Chapter 9, and Rachel Nickell, Chapters 4 and 7. More importantly, forensic science provides leads in police investigations and evidence for prosecutions that were previously unimaginable. Despite this, understanding of forensic science is poor even amongst those, such as lawyers and police officers, who are required to use it, as well as others such as politicians and journalists. Public understanding of the subject is largely based on TV shows such as CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, which use high-tech imagery for dramatic effect at the expense of understanding an increasingly important part of the criminal justice process. There is even the so-called CSI effect, that expectations and misconceptions about forensic science on the part of the public may have adverse influence on jury decisions. Dramatic scientific breakthroughs, particularly the discovery of DNA profiling in the past 20 years or so, have revolutionized forensic science. Evidence can be obtained from microscopic traces of body fluids, drugs, and explosives of sufficient quality for it to be pivotal in an investigation or trial. There has been a parallel revolution in how the police investigate crime. It is probably more effective, faster, and more reliable to investigate the crimes that affect us most, burglary, car theft, and such like, using DNA and fingerprints than by any other means. In major crimes such as homicide, forensic scientists have moved from being backroom boffins to the forefront of international investigations. Forensic science is now firmly embedded in the criminal justice agenda, since it can answer investigative questions in many instances better than any other means available. It is a complex activity at the interface of science and law. Forensic science is not a discipline in its own right, but engages many disciplines such as chemistry, molecular biology, and engineering, though it has a number of distinctive features. Whilst rooted in science, it is an intensely practical activity that deals with real-world issues: explosions, blood spatters, bodies, and stolen cars. Complex scientific findings must be weighed carefully and dispassionately, and communicated with clarity, simplicity, and precision to police, lawyers, jurors, and the judiciary. Forensic science encounters all aspects of human behavior. The apocryphal headline, "All human life is here," fits forensic science very well. The plain stupid, the killers who panicked and reburied a body for the third time in a flower bed in a graveyard; the unlucky, the man who wrote an anonymous threatening letter to the chairman of a London football club on paper with invisible indented impressions of his name and home address; to the cold and frighteningly malevolent, serial sexual offenders and killers who plan and fantasize about their crime throughout the course of their life, such as Robert Black, Chapter 7. In short, forensic science matters because the link to everyday life and death is more direct, tangible, and visible. But forensic science does not have all the answers. In some instances, it has no answers at all. For example, in the Michael Stone case, Chapters 1 and 3, and in some cases it fails spectacularly and worryingly for reasons that are not always clear. For example, the Jill Dano case. Forensic science is also regarded ambivalently by some, as is science by the public in general, and by others as a source of injustice. The arguments of the latter are rarely well informed in my experience, but I will explore some of these issues in this book. It would be impossible to do justice to all areas of forensic science in a book of this type and length, so I have necessarily had to select some things and exclude others. Whole areas of forensic science are completely absent. Toxicology, crash investigation, computer forensics, document examination, and others are dealt with superficially or in passing. In making this selection, I have attempted to identify the central issues of forensic science, such as identification and evidence evaluation, and its main procedures and mechanisms, such as continuity of evidence, chain of custody in the USA and many other countries, and minimizing contamination. Many of the cases I have used as illustrations come from direct personal involvement and memory. I have not provided detailed information in every case, as this is rarely necessary to gain an understanding, but in some instances the full details are already well publicized. It is my contention that you do not need to know the details of every area of forensic science to know the nature of forensic science. I will leave the listener to judge the success or otherwise of my efforts. Although science uses more or less universal terminology, that used in policing and the law varies considerably, even to the extent that the same word can mean different things in different jurisdictions. For example, the document containing forensic science evidence presented to the courts in England is called a statement, whereas the equivalent document in Scots law is called a joint report, and a statement means something else. In Scotland, items produced in evidence are called productions, whereas in England, the USA, Australia, and many other countries they are called exhibits. This is a constant problem when discussing or teaching forensic science. To overcome this, I have decided to abandon all attempts to be legally precise except where essential, and have used common-sense terminology such as item instead of production or exhibit, or report instead of joint report or statement. None of these infringements should impede understanding of the subject. The chapters generally follow the chronological flow of how forensic science interacts with the criminal law, incident, investigation, and laboratory analysis, from crime scene to court. Finally, a word on those CSI or eureka moments when the scientist cracks the case with a piece of brilliant incisiveness and basks in the admiration of their colleagues. Yes, they happen, but far less frequently than TV dramas would have you believe. Perhaps 5 or 6 times in a long career this might occur. In truth, most cases are solved by a combination of systematic investigation by a range of professionals, police officers, scientists, pathologists, CSIs, good teamwork, effective leadership, hard work, and some luck. I hope this comes across from the text. Chapter 1. What is forensic science? Klaus Mann, the son of Thomas Mann, discovered the corpse of his former lover who had shot himself through the heart. He recalled that The bloodstains looked like the scattered fragments of a mysterious pattern, a last message, a warning, the writing on the wall. Many believe the role of forensic science is to interpret such patterns, to read their message. Edmond Locard, 1877 to 1976, was one of the most influential thinkers in forensic science. Locard established the first police scientific laboratory for investigating crime scenes in Lyon, France in 1910. He also set out what many consider to be the fundamental basis and guiding principle of forensic science. This is most frequently formulated as every contact leaves a trace, although Locard never used these exact words. Paul Kirk, an American forensic scientist, expressed similar sentiments to Locard and Mann in even more detail and in more utilitarian terms. Wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. Not only his fingerprints or his footprints, but his hair, the fibers from his clothes, the glass he breaks, the tool mark he leaves, the paint he scratches, the blood or semen he deposits or collects. All of these and more bear mute witness against him. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. It is factual evidence. Physical evidence cannot be wrong, it cannot perjure itself, it cannot be wholly absent. Only human failure to find it, study, and understand it can diminish its value. This is one of the most commonly used and misattributed quotes in forensic science. Not only is there a story to be told, but according to Kirk, one cannot fail to read it. Directly or by implication, the message that is commonly taught to police officers and forensic science students is that these views represent reality, that there will always be evidence about such events, and ultimately that all things can be known about a crime or a criminal. Only failure on our part as humans can usurp this claim. Furthermore, this evidence is dispassionate, objective. Not only will we know things, there will only be one version of the truth, and therefore no disputes, and we have the last laugh, since all this can happen without the criminal even knowing. Do you believe this? Is it possible? My colleague Robin Williams calls this the forensic imaginary, the conviction that all events can be reconstructed from forensic evidence, that there is always a decipherable last message from the victim and evidence from the perpetrator, the signature of the killer. From my experience of forensic science, it is difficult to imagine a situation that is much further from reality. Locard's principle, as it is usually described, is not a scientific theory because it cannot be tested by scientific means, and it cannot predict in the way that scientific laws such as gravity or electromagnetism can. Nor could it be described as a model of the world. We would need much more evidence than we actually have to assert this. It is more a principle based on a thought experiment. Like other scientific principles, for example the cosmological principle, which makes certain simplifying but untrue assumptions about the distribution of matter in the universe, the point of it is to help us think about things when we have little or no data to go on. What we do know is that research supports Locard's assertions in part, but that there are also limitations to the application of these concepts. The flawed assumption is that once evidence is transferred, it remains in place, because we know that this is not the case. Generally speaking, such evidence will be lost, and often very quickly, perhaps a few hours after the event, as illustrated in Figure 1. We can therefore put forward a genuine scientific theory, one that can be tested on the basis of empirical evidence, the concept of transfer and persistence. For example, when items of clothing come into contact, fibers will be transferred from each to the other and then gradually lost. We have perhaps been a little hard on Locard and Kirk. So let's return to this with a thought experiment and imagine a world in which things are constantly being transferred and, as we now know, also lost. I sit on a fabric-covered seat on a train reading a book. Fibers from my clothing are transferred to the seat and from the seat to my clothing. When I arrive in my office, some fibers which remain on my clothing from the train seat will be transferred to my office seat. So far, so good. This is not too complicated, so let's continue with the experiment. Also being transferred to the train seat were fibers from my home environment, from upholstery, carpets, the clothing of my family, and maybe hairs from pets. And on the train seat, as well as fibers from passengers, will be fibers from their homes, some of which will transfer to my clothing and maybe to my office seat. Now it's quite complicated. There are fibers in my office from people on the train whom I have never been in contact with and who have never been in my office, although most of the fibers will be lost on the walk from the station. There may be fibers from things in my home in other people's offices, who were also on the train. All of these fibers will be mass-produced, so none of them is unique. It should be clear now that finding fibers that match someone's clothing in my office does not mean that that person has been in my office. In fact, it does not even mean that they have come from that person's clothing. To make sense of any fibers that are found, we need to bring in some modern concepts in forensic work: primary, direct, and secondary, indirect transfer. The fibers transferred from my clothing to the train seat, and the reverse, are due to direct transfer. The fibers from other people's clothing on my office seat are from indirect transfer. So, whilst every direct contact may leave a trace, traces may also be transferred which are not due to direct contact. The same principles apply to DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid traces. Finding a DNA profile that matches me on a gun does not mean that I must have handled the gun. The DNA may have been transferred indirectly from another item. Deciding whether traces are from direct or indirect contact requires more information, and we will explore this later. Making sense of all this involves uncertain information, scientific tests with inherent uncertainty, and subjective interpretation of test results made by fallible humans. The final twist to this tale is that all of these activities, examinations, and interpretations must comply with the law and legal procedure. This takes science from the laboratory into a very different world, in which the interpretation of the scientific evidence may depend on the law. For although science is essentially universal, it is the same in Glasgow, New York, and Beijing, the law is local and surprisingly variable, at least to scientists. Furthermore, in common law systems such as those in the UK, USA, Australia, and Canada, the rules of evidence constrain what can be said in court, including what scientific or expert evidence can be presented. The law decides for itself what can and cannot be heard, and fundamental to the common law is the adversarial process and the notion that argument is the best way to get to the bottom of what any set of facts means. The law is the final nail in the coffin for Kirk and Locard and any grand vision of certainty, objectivity, and infallibility. But we should acknowledge their originality, creative imagination, insight, and the influence they have had in inspiring scientists to develop more rigorous empirically based theories. Much of forensic science is aimed at identifying things, people, objects, substances. But what do we mean by identify? Identify means different things to different people and has a common sense usage, which varies depending on context, as well as philosophical interpretations. Identity is central to the criminal justice process, since we must be certain that a person arrested or found guilty is unequivocally who we believe them to be, irrespective of who they say they are. So, what do the terms identity or identify mean to a forensic scientist? You may be surprised to find that it depends whom you ask, and that different disciplines within forensic science use different standards and criteria to identify things. Although the terms are not universally used, most forensic scientists will draw a distinction between classification of things, placing an object in a defined category, and identification, the recognition of uniqueness, that something is one of a kind. Classification can be a continuous process. A car, a red sports car, a red sports car with damaged bodywork, which increasingly moves towards narrower or smaller categories, whereas identification is a final and categoric determination of uniqueness, the red sports car with the damaged bodywork abandoned at the scene of the crash. There is only one such vehicle. Some forensic scientists, especially in the USA, use another word which helps avoid some of this confusion: individualization. This was coined by Paul Kirk and has the benefit of being unambiguous. If you individualize something, it is one of a kind, unique. It has not merely been classified, no matter how few things there are in the class. Kirk suggested that individualization is the primary aim of forensic science, but this cannot be the full story. There are very many instances when individualization cannot take place for reasons of practicality or technological limitations, and there are many instances where individualization is not necessary to answer an investigative question. Many experienced forensic scientists consider that answering investigative questions is the aim of forensic science, irrespective of how this is done, and this is a view I share. Evidence that falls a long way short of individualization can be relevant and valuable in a criminal inquiry. In the Michael Stone case, Chapter 3, it was known that the killer had searched through the family's belongings, including the children's lunchboxes. A partial finger mark in blood was found inside one of the lunchboxes. The finger mark contained too little information to identify anyone, but had sufficient detail to eliminate Stone, an important fact for the defense case. So, what is forensic science? Definitions don't usually help because they often evoke a connection between law and science without providing much insight into the complexities of this odd relationship. I think it is better to describe than define. For me, forensic science is the investigation, explanation, and evaluation of events of legal relevance, including the identity, origin, life history, and interactions of humans, materials, for example, paint, plastics, substances, for example, drugs and poisons, and artifacts, for example, clothing, shoes. This is done using a variety of techniques or methodologies, some of which are scientific, which allow us to describe, infer, and reconstruct events. The reconstruction is based on the analysis and evaluation of indirect fragmentary physical evidence, what remains of the traces, and relevant information. From these facts, established to some predetermined legal standard, the law infers behavior, motivation, and criminal intent. In short, forensic science answers the central questions in a criminal investigation: who, what, where, when, why, and how. Answers to these questions include the identity of the criminal or victim using DNA profiling or fingerprints, what type of shoe left the mark at the crime scene, the sequence of events that led to a death as established by bloodstain pattern analysis, where a shot was fired from, or how a fire has started and why it burned so fiercely, from analysis of flammable liquids. We will consider many of these issues in more detail in subsequent chapters, describing the processes involved, the methods of analysis, how the evidence is interpreted, and ultimately, how it is presented in court. Chapter 2. Investigating Crime. Forensic science takes place within the complexities and procedures of the law, its timescales, pressures and contingencies, the drama of a criminal investigation, and occasionally in the intense glare of the media. This chapter explains how the police investigate crime, setting out some of the principles and procedures involved, and how forensic science provides answers to the important questions we identified at the end of Chapter 1. Science is the best means we have of describing and understanding the physical world, and forensic science has fundamentally changed the way the police investigate crime, legally, procedurally, and conceptually, because it can answer many of these important questions faster and more objectively than by any other means. A crime is a breach of the criminal law that requires two elements: a mental element, mens rea, a guilty mind, and a physical element, actus reus, the guilty act. It is not possible to directly establish mens rea using physical evidence. It must be inferred from the activities and behavior of the accused. To commit a crime, the accused must have the intent to do wrong and to carry out the act. A criminal investigation is a search for information with the aim of bringing an offender to justice, which is achieved by reconstructing the events leading up to, during, and sometimes after the crime. This is done by gathering facts and information, speaking to witnesses, extracting data from CCTV and phones, recovering documents, and carrying out scientific examinations with the aim of answering the most important questions: who, what, why, when, where, how. Effective investigations require skills, resources, and time. Complex investigations, such as serial offenses and homicides, also need coordination and planning during both the investigation and the trial. Most serious crimes will be investigated by a team of detectives and specialist police officers led by a senior investigating officer, SIO, an experienced and trained detective. In the UK and many other countries, the police have systems and procedures in place to help achieve their aims. The modern approach to investigating major crime in the UK followed serious problems in the investigation of the Yorkshire Ripper case in the 1980s. In pre-computer days, the police were overwhelmed by paper records and unable to link together important findings from thousands of separate leads or to track the outcomes of various aspects of the investigation. This, as well as a number of investigative failings, delayed the arrest and prosecution of Peter Sutcliffe, who was subsequently convicted. A review carried out following the trial recommended major changes in procedure that included the use of standard operating procedures in major inquiries, introduction of computer systems, HOLMES, Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, and a new specialist scientific role in complex inquiries to ensure that forensic science is focused on the primary objectives of the investigation. Forensic science also came to public prominence following high-profile miscarriages of justice in England in the 1990s. One of these cases, the Birmingham Six, who were wrongly convicted of terrorist offenses, included specific failings in the scientific aspects of the investigation. Following a royal commission which considered this case and others, there were radical changes in English law and forensic science practices. The main change with respect to forensic science was the introduction of formal quality assurance systems to standardize laboratory practices. In legal terms, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, 1984, was introduced to specify how the police deal with accused persons, go about their investigations, and are accountable for their actions. These and other changes have led the police to take an approach which is based on the systematic elimination of individuals from an investigation, trace, interview, eliminate, tie, until one person is left who may be the offender. If we take a homicide as an example, there will be a number of individuals who will be high on the list for tie, such as those who had access to the scene at the time of the crime, known associates of the victim or those living locally, individuals with previous convictions, especially for violence, those with physical characteristics similar to the suspected offender, owners of vehicles of the same type as that known or suspected to be involved. The tie process, when applied systematically, gradually accumulates vast amounts of information of increasingly fine granularity on the identity, behavior, activities, relationships, and history of individuals. This includes information such as where they work, who they go drinking with, what their hobbies are, who they're having affairs with, who is in debt, who has suddenly come into money, who has recently had a dispute or fight. Such inquiries will also reveal relationships between people and places and objects of interest to the inquiry, such as vehicles or crime scenes. Much of this information is of no interest to the police, as they will be focused on what is required to be established to detect and then prosecute the particular offense. Tie actions are combined with other common investigative lines, such as house-to-house inquiries, canvassing, and tracing local individuals with convictions for similar offenses, modus operandi suspects. All relevant lines of inquiry are identified and logged on the computer specially developed for this purpose, HOLMES. This is then used to aid prioritizing of the most important inquiries, the allocation of tasks to specific officers, and the recording of the outcomes from these tasks. All information is then stored in a single database which can be interrogated and used to develop and test hypotheses. HOLMES also helps identify facts and witnesses which corroborate each other, as well as inconsistencies, for example in witness accounts, which can then be reinvestigated. The information that comes from these inquiries can be fragmentary and incomplete. Not all things are knowable. The analogy of investigation most frequently used is that of a jigsaw puzzle. So long as you have the pieces, only time and persistence are required to solve the puzzle. This is a poor analogy for such a complex event as a major crime for a number of reasons. Even when the crime is solved and prosecuted, the puzzle is rarely complete. In the Michael Stone case, Chapter 3, the weapon was never found. The body of Suzanne Pilley has never been found. Nor does the puzzle need to be complete, since the law does not expect the answer to every question, but proof of the key facts and elimination of reasonable alternatives. And these facts will be rendered in an adversarial legal process in which there are always two sides to any story. There is always an alternative explanation, always some missing piece of the problem. Investigations and trials are contingent, restricted by the rules of evidence and procedure, and limited by time and resources. A trial is only a search for the truth in this narrow sense. Investigation of many different types of crime can be supported or resolved by a wide range of forensic analyses that can provide the answers to who, what, why, when, where, and how. On 4 May 2010.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?